Hello again, friends. Time for a ultra serious podcast with a not so serious name. Let's call this one World War E for Ebola. Yes, that is a spinoff of the World War Z movie, and by the end of this podcast, I'll be talking about zombies, believe it or not. But so many folks have been hitting me up asking me to do a rant on this whole gigantic, huge Ebola virus scare. Should we be terrified here in the United States and or Western Europe and or in Africa? What's going on with this whole mess? What's the deal? I'll try to go through about 10 million aspects of Ebola in an extremely short podcast. Right. In an extremely long podcast that I'll try to keep short. How about we call it that right up front? So, because of the serious nature of this, let's get serious. What is the whole deal with this Ebola? For starters, it's a what we call a hemorrhagic fever. And there are many others, like malaria, like influenza, something that you're much more likely to get. Even though you getting a common cold or just feeling sick, people say you have the flu. No, not really. You may have the cold or something else, but influenza is the real flu, and when you have it, you'll know it. Hemorrhagic fever is something that it's a virus, a RNA-based virus that gets into a body and replicates very rapidly and causes severe fever, always a severe fever. And there's a bunch of other hemorrhagic fevers as well, but it's a severe fever enough that it can kill a human. It can make you be so hot it kills you, or it starts to break down your interior organs. And that, or the cells inside of you, and maybe interior organs, and that's why the Ebola stuff is so scary, because it's one of the worst hemorrhagic fevers that we've come across yet in human existence, because the mortality rates are so high. It right this second is killing 50 to 90% of the people that it comes in contact with, and that's significant. And yes, that's scary. Imagine this, saying something to the effect of, "Oh, well, this is a highly transmittable disease, kind of like the common cold. And if you get the common cold, half the people who get it die." Whoa, okay, that's a little frightening. This thing has actually only been known, it was discovered back in 1976. Yes, I know, before you were born, before your time, but that's not that long ago. We've known about influenza for a long time. We've known about malaria for a long time. This one's a newer one on the world stage. And they're not exactly sure what's really going on with it. And obviously, as you know from the news, there's no cure. No cure, and treatment is hydrate the patient and hope they live through it. That's not very comforting either. So it was discovered in 1976. The initial breakout of this was in South Sudan. It was Sudan at the time. But in South Sudan, 284 people came down with this bizarre hemorrhagic fever. 151 of them died. In the same year, a few months later, another breakout occurred in the what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Back then it was called Zaire. And in that circumstance, 318 people were diagnosed with it, and 280 of them died. It's like a 90% mortality rate. And again, this is 1976. People are saying, "What is this? We don't even know what this is." And everybody who gets it dies. It's in that DRC outbreak in 76 where the virus got its name. Ebola is named for a river in northern Congo, Northern Democratic Republic of Congo, in a small little river, more like a stream that feeds into another bigger river that feeds into the Congo River. So, and it's in northern Congo, named for the initial case that they found in a village near this Ebola River. So it's a geographic place name, actually. You can go look up the Ebola River. Again, we have, in these outbreaks, hundreds of people that die. And even back then, way back then in the middle of Africa, people knew this stuff was so deadly that part of the key to it not going any further was governments and the World Health Community shut this stuff down. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is so weird. Quarantine the area, and don't let anybody in or out," and it's contained. The second major outbreak occurred again in the DRC in 1995, killing another 200 to 300 people. And it was kind of lulled then until about 2000 when it broke out again in Uganda, killing another 200 to 225 people. And again, in each of these events, it's in sub-Saharan African countries. They've usually cropped up in villages. very rural settings, and somehow it gets reported, and people from the outside and the governments involved get in there and have stopped it fairly quickly. Well, what's going on now? Well, this is why it's become a world phenomenon. By the way, nobody had heard about Ebola in the last 30 or 40 years since this initial outbreak in 1976, unless you were into virology, unless you studied these things, or unless you read this awesome book called The Hot Zone, which was later made into a movie called Outbreak, that discussed this very virus and how lethal it was and how dangerous it would be if it ever got out into the world community. So, in a sense, what we have right now happening in the world is art that has a life that is mimicking art. Because here in 2014, we have what is now the absolute worst outbreak, and it's an outbreak, a pandemic of this virus in the history of mankind, of humankind. With now, let me see if I can find the figures. As of a couple days ago, they're saying officially 8,376 suspected and or confirmed cases of it, 4,030 dead. So you're looking at a 50% mortality rate overall. Again, this is very strange. There's not many things out there on planet Earth that when you get it, you got a coin's toss chance of surviving it. So this is a really lethal virus. Those numbers I just reported, 8,000 cases, 4,000 dead, very likely vastly underreported. Very likely, given the circumstances and the countries that it's involved in, the numbers are probably way bigger because there are people in rural areas or who have just refused to go to the hospital or have just gotten lost in the sauce and have died out somewhere on their own. The numbers are very likely much higher than this. So geographically, where is it occurring now? The other new component of this is not only the scale at which the outbreak is happening, but the placement, the geographic placement. It's happening in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone in West Africa. It's still sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, but it's up to this point happened in Central Africa, and now we're over here in West Africa. Why is that of some consequence as geographers? Because there's a whole bunch more people in West Africa, for starters. Population significantly higher and significantly more clustered in urban areas. Nigeria, which is in West Africa and has already had a few confirmed cases, is the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll get to this in a second. I fear greatly for humanity if the outbreak that's occurring in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, at that scale, reaches Nigeria. By the way, Katie, can you Google real quick and how many people are in Nigeria? I want to say instinctively, I want to say 80 million. I don't know why that number's popping into my head. So the geographic origin is unique for this outbreak. It's never been there before. Always been in Central Africa. And the exponential growth of it is now wildly greater than anything that's happened before. Why is this a really big deal for West Africa and maybe not such a huge big deal for America? Well, I'll elaborate more on that in a second. But I do want you to understand the consequences of what's happening here. Who do you think are the first peoples to get hit by viruses like this that are this lethal? We don't know the origin. I think they said it's somebody somewhere in Guinea who was near, in the forest, in a rural area near the borders of Liberia and Sierra Leone, that was first reported. But when people get sick, they go to the hospitals. And everybody gets sick, goes to the hospital. And so you have regular people who are dying in droves. But of course, before they figured out what it was, you have hospital staffs who are dying in droves. So the doctors and nurses. And this is what's compounding the situation. You already have healthcare systems that really aren't up to scale in terms of the developed world. You don't have as much healthcare accessibility. You don't have the same levels of technology. You don't have access to standards of sanitation and all these other things. And so the disease can spread more easily in hospitals when people are clustering together and they're sick. And they're taking out the very healthcare workers that these countries need to try to get a handle on this. So this is why it's starting to spiral out of control in a very big way. And then add to that, feels like a quiz question, add to that malaria actually kills more people than Ebola has. Malaria kills more people every year than Ebola has thus far in human history. And I've seen this figure, and I'm going to pop it in here. in lots of different places that a lot of press agencies and stories are reporting, hey, everybody needs to chill out and not worry so much about this Ebola thing because there's a whole bunch of other diseases that kill way more people on a daily basis in Africa. For instance, and here's the figure, deaths per day in these same countries where there's been 4,000 Ebola deaths. Tuberculosis kills 110 people. Diarrhea will kill 404. Malaria will kill 552 people. Is that a daily? Is that the graph saying daily? Deaths per day, that's right. Malaria kills 552 people on a daily basis. And HIV/AIDS kills 685 people on a daily basis. 685 people will die from AIDS in these three countries. So the reporting now is this Ebola thing may be getting a little blown out of proportion because all these other diseases kill a lot more people on a daily basis. And I say, hang on, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges there. These other diseases are diseases of the developing world, of the underdeveloped world, if you want to call it that. They happen with regularity. They are due to a number of cultural, social, and healthcare reasons. And so, yes, it's terrible that 552 people die of malaria every year. Or every day. That's terrible. But I don't see how they're comparing that to Ebola because Ebola has zero history of killing anybody in Sierra Leone, and now 4,000 people are dead. So the fear here, and I believe it is a very real and tangible fear that should be respected, is more people may die of something else, but the exponential growth of this particular disease and the potential for it to go even further and kill way many more people far exceeds how many people are going to die of malaria this year. That's why it's more dangerous and does warrant some fear. Having said that, here's another reason I want you to worry about West Africa, because malaria season is actually just now starting. So, again, it's predictable that thousands and thousands of people are going to die from malaria in Africa this year and in West Africa right now this year. And the malaria season is now starting. It's like the flu season in the United States. It's just now starting. And the health care systems in this country are already taxed to the max. They can't even keep up with the Ebola stuff. Hospitals are packed full of people who have Ebola. And now malaria season is starting with more people who are going to get sick from a pandemic disease that's there all the time. So this is, or is it epidemic? Is that an epidemic disease that's there all the time and a pandemic that occurs all at once? I can't remember. But this is something that occurs on a frequent, regular basis. And now the healthcare system is going to be expected to take care of the irregular people who are supposed to be sick this time of year. So this is a real triple whammy for these countries in West Africa, not to even speak to the fact that tourism has evaporated, that economic ties are starting to be severed, that nobody wants to go into these places, that the world is talking about banning flights out of these places. So these are countries who are already struggling on a good year. They're developing countries that are struggling, that there is poverty and there's sickness and there's malaria and HIV/AIDS. And they're getting whammied by this particular disease, which is crushing their healthcare system more and their economy big time. So this is something that could continue to spiral out of control for various other reasons outside of the virus itself. Okay? All right. Whew! It feels like a podcast already, but let's press on. Lots more to go. What is so lethal about this virus that's so different than other viruses? We don't know. And now I'll get to some of the reasons why. If you're in West Africa, I would worry. I would be very worried. If I had friends in South Africa, I do have some friends in South Africa, I'm worried. I have many Nigerian friends. I'm very worried about Nigeria, and it's not even there yet. It's not. The rates of infection that's really blowing up in these other countries hasn't even happened in Nigeria yet, and God forbid it does, because if it continues to exponentially increase in cases, which it's been doing since May, should step back. The first reported case was actually in December. A young child died in December, and by January they figured out it was Ebola, and then there was a few cases here and there, and by May is when it started to ramp up and really get out of control in the last couple months. So you have exponential growth and exponential spread of this disease, and that's what's so scary. And if it gets to bigger populations in bigger urban areas, all hell could break loose. You could truly have a zombie movie on your hands, and I'm not even joking about it. It is very scary stuff if you're in those areas. Okay, let's get back to our part of the world. Why is it perhaps being a little blown out of proportion, and you really don't have to worry about it that much in the United States, even though We've had this case reported of a guy who got on a plane in Liberia, went to Brussels, then went to Texas, and died in the hospital there. And one of the nurses that cared for him at the hospital now has Ebola. That's making all the big headlines, and again, everybody's starting to panic and worry about it. Why should you not worry so much? Well, Ebola is a pretty dumb virus, actually. It's wicked lethal, but actually that's what makes it dumb. And it's not dumb in life. It just is what it is. It's a biological entity. It's not good or bad. It is. But it actually is a really terrible virus for humans. Not because it kills them, but actually precisely because it kills them too fast. Think about it. For all creatures, their mission is to replicate and keep going, even our species. So we procreate and keep going so that the species keeps going. And in Ebola's case, it replicates so fast and kills the host so fast that it burns itself out too quickly. So it's a very dumb virus when it comes to inhabiting humans. If you want to inhabit another creature, and that creature is your host, you don't want to kill the home you're in. So the smartest viruses are ones like the common cold or other, even bacteria. Our bodies are filled with viruses and bacteria that just hang out and procreate and live and don't really affect the host that much. This is a bad virus. It is for humans because it burns itself out. It kills its own host, and that's not a good a life strategy to keep your DNA and RNA going in the long cycle of things. It actually, we human types think, this is not confirmed, we think that the virus actually lives in bats. They have tested more often than not, they're the host that this particular virus can live in and not kill the host. So, and it's mostly fruit bats, and in fruit bats in Africa. And the only way that it's been transmitted to humans that we know of, it's a non-airborne virus, which is another reason you don't have to worry too much. But it's transmitted to humans, again, we think, through the practice of preparing and eating bushmeat. That is meat that locals in different African societies go out to the forest and hunt themselves and kill, namely bats. We don't eat bats here. They eat bats. Some people eat bats there. And even chimpanzees and gorillas, and maybe some other mammals of the forest, but we think those are the main three that can harbor this particular virus, and that people in these societies may go out and hunt that meat, and then when they consume the meat, that's how the virus gets in. There's really no other way for it to get into a human unless they physically contact it, touch it, consume it. The virus can live in a dead host for days after the host is already dead. So you kill something, ordinarily all things cease, but this virus keeps on living. So if you killed a monkey, killed a fruit bat, and then took it home a couple days later and ate it, and it had this virus, then it can jump into the human system. Again, we think that's how it's being transmitted. So for starters, you don't got to worry too much. It doesn't exist here naturally, and the animals that it can survive in and thrive in, and therefore spread to, those animals aren't here either. The other thing that should be calming to you is that it is not an airborne virus, meaning it is fluid-based. It doesn't spread. If an Ebola person sneezes or coughs, you can't get it unless they sneeze directly into your face and spit from their mouth goes into your mouth, because it's fluid-based. The virus can't survive out in air by itself. So even if somebody with Ebola, I think, touched a doorknob, it might last for a minute or 2 or 5, but it can't hang out there indefinitely. It has to be in some sort of bodily fluid. And that's how it gets passed from person to person, through fluids, namely blood, sweat, and tears. So again, people in hospitals have to touch this stuff and deal with this stuff. And if you don't know that someone has this virus and you touch it, apparently it's extremely good at gripping on to the next host if you've touched any fluid of an infected person and then jumping into your system. So there's blood, sweat, and tears, but there's also the unmentionable sex fluids. And apparently it's very virulent in those as well. So any contact you have with an infected person, you have to actually touch, get barfed on, sweat on, spit on, in order for that to then get into your body. Now you may say, well, that still seems like it spreads fairly easily, but actually doesn't. It doesn't. What we're really scared about in the planet, if you know about these things, we're much more fearful of things that spread via the air. Those are the ones that you need to be like, oh, because if somebody can sneeze on the other side of the room, and then that virus can float around, and then you breathe it in, danger, danger. And that's where you get influenza pandemics, and that's why influenza is so lethal, is that it can spread through contact, through fluids, through contact, and also airborne. So Ebola, you can breathe a little easier, pun intended. It's not transmitted via air. If it morphs, it tweaks its own chemistry and figures out a way to go airborne, then we're in trouble. Okay, but we haven't got to that point yet. The other reason not to worry so much is there is so far no zoonotic vector. That's a good term. zoonotic. Zoo, like animals. So there's not a zoonotic vector for this sucker, meaning that there is no animals that it's directly transmitted to humans. So like avian flus that you've heard of, and that's the source for a lot of H1N1, H5N15, all those things. A lot of those are avian flus, or maybe you've even heard of swine flus. These are viruses that hang out in birds or beasts, and then can, under certain circumstances, be transmitted directly to a human. Maybe not even through consumption, but through the air or through touch or other things. Again, this Ebola it has no zoonotic vector. I just told you it lives in fruit bats, but you got to eat the damn bat. I mean, you got to go out of your way to get this sucker. The World Health Community is terrified that this virus might jump to an animal that it then morphs in, and then it does have a zoonotic vector that it could be more easily spread, which is why, FYI, if you read the story about the Spanish nurse that contracted it, and they killed her dog. Oh, man, did you hear about that? They killed her dog? That's just not right. That's why they did it. Anybody who gets this disease, they're going to be very leery. They don't want, I say they, doctors, scientists types, they don't want to give this virus an opportunity to hang out with humans and live animals, because who the hell knows what it'll do if it starts to go back and forth. And again, if it gets into birds or dogs, and then suddenly dogs can give it to other dogs, and dogs are all over the damn place, and then it can more easily jump from dogs to humans, now we got trouble. But right now, no zoonotic vector. It's only fluid-based, so you kind of really have to touch it and mess around with it to get it. Again, if you do touch it, it can jump hold pretty quickly, and it's that 50 to 90% death rate that terrifies everybody. So I'm not that worried about Ebola in America. I'm very worried about it in West Africa. How many people in Nigeria, by the way?
174 million.
Oh, I was way off. 174 million Nigerians packed into an area probably about the size of Pennsylvania. Well, maybe Pennsylvania, New York. It's a lot of humans packed into a small space in close proximity. And you're starting to see now, that's how a lot of African urban areas are. A lot of people packed into a small space with maybe not highest levels of sanitation and cultural practices where they bathe the dead after they've died and you clean them up. And there's even some death practices in certain parts of Africa where you would kiss the corpse before you bury it. So, and now I've told you that the virus can live for several days after the person's dead. So this is why you having this level of contagion. People in close quarters, lower levels of sanitation, not aware of the disease initially, and cultural practices are all compounding the spread of this disease. But none of those things would happen in the United States. That's why I'm saying I wouldn't worry so much in the U.S. Very worried about Nigeria and West Africa. Now, I'm not that worried about Ebola. You probably shouldn't be either, unless you're planning on traveling to go to West Africa, in which case, good luck. Roll that dice. However, that's not to say that you shouldn't worry about pandemic diseases in a globalized world, because we are much more worried about any form of this H1N1 influenza virus that would become so virulent and so strong as it would be easily passed via airborne. I think, and again, I'm not a doctor or a virologist, but I think the influenzas can be airborne. But so far, they haven't been airborne like between the bird and humans. And our fear is if one very virulent strain becomes airborne between species, and all of a sudden like, oh crap, because here's the deal, you can't control where birds go. And birds go all over the world. So if it starts to, you get some nasty one that goes into birds and can be transmitted via air to humans, watch out. And this has actually happened in the past, which is why we're so scared about the flu and why you go get flu shots every year. If you want to get truly terrified, I wouldn't read up on Ebola. Go read up on the 1918 Spanish influenza or the 1918 flu pandemic. This was a worldwide pandemic. Worldwide. 1918. That's before the advent of air travel. Yes, they had airplanes in 1918, and the Red Baron fought some folks over Europe with them. But regular people didn't go get on airlines. And certainly not millions of people on a daily basis would get on airplanes and fly all over the world. All right, so back in 1918, a strain of virus came out that was so lethal, it just spread all over planet Earth. And dig this, friends, if you want to be scared, 500 million people on planet Earth were affected by that one strain. 500 million. 500 million people got it. And at the time, I'm just going to spitball it here, I think there was only about 2.5 million people alive in 1918. And a quarter of them got this. A quarter of humans got this flu. And again, they don't even know for sure. 50 to 100 million people died. 50 to 100 million people in the world died from this one influenza pandemic. That's what scientists and doctors are terrified of happening again right now in a globalized, connected world in which people can run around all over the place all the time. And maybe this virus, future virus, wouldn't exhibit symptoms, but you could be spreading it. So before you even know you're sick, you could be coughing and spitting and sneezing on an airplane and everybody in the plane gets it. And there are things, I think chicken pox is one of them. I can't remember this. I have this off the top of my head because my kids both had chicken pox. I had chicken pox. Chicken pox and I believe measles are both so virulent, so strong that if someone walks into a room, let's say a 100-foot by 100-foot room, and someone walks in a door on the other side of the room and coughs, and you're on this side of the room, your chances of getting it are like high. That's a scary one. And that's what we're scared. Oh, what if another influenza gets that bad? And then we're in a globalized world where people are moving around all over the place. That's when the shizzle gets scary. The influenza, that Spanish influenza 1918, killed more people than that died in World War I, which was happening at the time. It decreased the life expectancy in America by 12 years. In 1 year, the life expectancy went down by 12 because it killed so many people. And it was airborne in a time before airplanes. So that's what gets scary, and that's what you should be worried about in the future and why we should support building better global healthcare systems and global healthcare responses. I think this Ebola thing, it's horrific for Africa, and it might turn into a global thing. I actually don't think so, but it might. If any good can come of this, it will be a wake-up call for planet Earth to say, wow, this shizzle could actually really happen. And we should probably get our ducks in a row now before it happens. So I don't mean to get all preachy here, but you want to think about these things in the future in a very connected world in which we now live. And I'll kind of finish up with this. I don't think there's a huge, credible, real risk for America. I think the real risk is in the countries that are already exhibiting this exponential rise, all of West Africa, and again, specifically, I'm saying it for the 20th time, if it gets to Nigeria with 170 million people, you could be looking at, if it's not contained, and they're really worried that they're not going to be able to contain it in the next several months. If it gets to Nigeria, think about the porosity of the borders. They don't have border control in many of these West African countries, and people are getting scared, and people are hauling ass out of Liberia and Sierra Leone. Where are they going? Countries next door. If it gets into Nigeria, 170 million people in extremely packed urban areas, this could spiral out of control and be the worst Worst ever pandemic, worst ever death count in human history. I shudder to even say this out loud. But if they don't get a handle on this soon, and many of us are worried that they can't, that you could be seeing in the next 6 months to a year, 1 million people dead, 5 million people dead, 50 million people dead. That's the thing about virulent diseases. They increase exponentially, not mathematically. So it ain't going to be another 100 people die. It's going to be another 10,000 people are infected who infect 100,000 people who affect 1 million people. So this is pretty scary stuff for Africa. And I would add other places where they have like circumstances, meaning not as good healthcare systems, not as good ability to isolate patients, and not a good coordinated ability to raise the level of sanitation and healthcare. And that would be places like India, and God forbid it gets to China. I mean, you have extremely cram-packed urban areas with perhaps not the highest level of sanitation. People in close contact, this is where this particular virus thrives. You gotta touch, spit, sneeze, snot, sweat. So people think about the people crammed into trains in India and China, and if one person has this disease, how quickly it would be touched off into other folks. So I worry about highly urbanized, highly populated areas that don't have the highest levels of healthcare access. Those are the folks that I significantly also worry about. But I'll end with this. Why has this disease caught the popular imagination of the world, and again, particularly scaring the sweet bejesus out of folks here in America? I think it has a lot to do with popular culture. Zombies. I titled this podcast World War E, because what we're seeing with this Ebola mimics all of the sci-fi horror films that are zombieism. And just think about it. What is this fascination with zombies and why are they scary and all this stuff is because all zombie stories, almost all of them, it's some sort of virus. And think about all these movies, the zombie movies that have come out. Dawn of the Dead all the way up to I Am Legend? Is that the one with Will Smith and zombie stuff? They're all viruses that spread extremely rapidly, that have a high mortality rate, a high infection rate that scientists can't stop. They can't figure it out. They don't know what's going on. What it builds into is panic and social disorder, the breakdown of society that occurs when zombies take over and everybody's left to fend for themselves. And that's what you're seeing in West Africa. And again, I'm not making light of this situation. This is why it's terrifying to the Western world, who actually does not have that much to fear about it, is we're seeing a real live zombie movie take over. And then there's the thought that zombie movie could happen in our society. And it scares the sweet bejesus out of people. It drives mass panic and social disorder and social collapse. And it's terrifying. And it is terrifying. And you think about all these movies that play this up, all the zombie genre, but if you really want to get a sense of how diseases spread, and this particular one, I don't know that I go watch zombie movies so much as perhaps go read the novel called Hot Zone, which I believe was made into the movie called Contagion, that does a decent job portraying this very kind of outbreak with Ebola. I think in Contagion they don't name the virus, but it's assumed to be Ebola. I'm sorry, a Hot Zone was made into Outbreak. The best movie to watch for this is Contagion. Contagion is a more recent movie that apparently even doctors and scientists have said that's a really well done movie, and it really shows what can happen on the global level with a virus much like this one that could spiral out of control if it goes airborne. One last thought, the other reason it's terrifying to people is because this particular virus, it really affects humans nasty. And I saved this for the last, so the people who get squeamish, maybe you can stop watching at this point. But what this virus does, and again, I saved this to last, is it replicates so rapidly in your body, it starts to destroy your cells. You get this spiked fever and a rash and headache and all this other stuff, but it basically starts to liquefy you from the inside out. So one of the other serious symptoms of this is internal and external bleeding. So you basically start to internally bleed because your organs are becoming liquefied. The cell walls break down and the organs themselves start to break down. And people can even then start to bleed through their skin, start sweating blood through their eyes, nose, mouth, just blood. Can you imagine? And now we're getting into true blood and vampirism, where people are bleeding blood or crying blood. And anything that attacks the human body and affects us so rapidly like that, it gives us the heebie-jeebies. It's giving me the heebie-jeebies talking about it. You think about, like, what's scary about Alien is this alien gets into a human body and rips you up from the inside out. So there's all sorts of pop cultural parallels which make the reality of what Ebola does to a human exceptionally scary to us as individuals, but also exceptionally scary to the social chaos and disorder and collapse of civilization that it might bring about as well. Is that scary enough for you? I'll end with this note. You shouldn't be that scared in America with a high level of healthcare, where we can isolate this stuff, where this wouldn't happen, where things are in place, and the vector's not here, and the animals aren't here, and we all know about it, we're well informed, we have great communications. Much more worried about it in other places where the geographic stage is set in terms of demography and healthcare systems and perhaps lack of development, where this particular virus, the Ebola virus, could take root and exponentially wipe out a large number of humans. I'm saying it again with fingers crossed. Please, 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 I hope I'm wrong. But if it goes too far, it could wipe out millions of humans if it's not very soon and very quickly gotten under control. Does that answer your Ebola questions? Are you ready to go hide under your bed for the next 6 months? I wouldn't worry about it too much in America, but for now, we're out.